Texas's grid is supposed to be built for heat, but now many Texans are frustrated and worried that power plants are failing before summer.
This has not gotten the attention it deserved. This, on some level, would be the most expensive natural disaster in American history if it was only counted as that. Let's go into exactly what happened. If you forget, Winter Storm Uri hit, weather dropped for a week, power prices surged to records. That cut down and shut down a lot of power generation. 4.5 million Texans lost power to their home. It's its own grid. They couldn't bring in power from other states, and so you saw 200 plus lose their lives. Water got shut off. In some cases, people did not have water in their homes for weeks or even months because the pipes burst.
6 Texas power plants failed in the midst of a May heat wave in a state that boasts an electric grid that is independent of the rest of the nation. Now, I'm Yasmin Khan with Rebel HQ, and let me just say that there is a lot to this story, and it really is like a whole story. This goes back to Enron, rolling blackouts in California, several Texan governors, including George W. Bush, the failings of capitalism, and the deregulation of industries. But I will try not to make this video too terribly long. But first, some context. I live in Houston, Texas, and it's a city that prides itself on being the energy capital of the entire world. People from Austin and Dallas come to Houston and they complain about the heat, so it's pretty hot here even for other Texans. That said, I didn't realize we were in the midst of a heat wave until I read about it. In other words, this kind of heat isn't unusual enough that it's setting alarm bells off for Texans. But that said, it's only May. It's not even summertime yet, so we can probably safely expect that temperatures will climb even higher than they are now in the coming months. For reference, today the high is 94, I think, so triple-digit temperatures in Texas are not uncommon, at least not in recent years. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that these power plants really should be able to handle this kind of heat. And without air conditioning, this heat really can be deadly. People here survive because we have AC everywhere. It's in our homes, our shops, our workplaces, it's in our cars, and we really, as a people, don't go outside very much during the day in the summer. Our downtown even has a series of underground air-conditioned tunnels so that downtown workers don't have to walk to lunch outside in the heat. The tunnels are actually pretty cool. So the Texas power grid, as many of you probably know, is separate from the rest of the nation. This country has an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. Texans have always been aware of this. It's even referred to sometimes as a point of pride, but the rest of the nation may not have known about our grid, at least not before the winter of 2021.
We've been looking at the decay of the grid and the decay of reliable electricity provided to the grid for many years. Blackouts and brownouts would not surprise me.
And there's a lot of talk right now, and that's the problem. There's not a lot of action. One thing they are doing is they are proposing to make sure that natural gas relay stations are deemed critical infrastructure, an important distinction, because that means power companies, when they panic, like ERCOT did last February, can't shut that down, which means the power plants can at least keep getting natural gas, because remember, they didn't shut down because they were cold. They shut down because the power got shut off at the relay stations, so they couldn't get the fuel they need. So the short answer is no, nothing has really changed, but of course there's a lot of talk.
Yes, before we talk about hot, we have to talk about cold. So back in February 2021, the nation dealt with a polar vortex that plunged much of the South into freezing temperatures that the people weren't used to. So for those of you who don't live in the South, I'm sure it's not hard to understand that southern states aren't equipped to deal with extreme cold simply because it doesn't happen very often. For instance, we don't have fleets of snow plows and salt trucks to deploy at the first signs of black ice. We don't know how to drive in icy conditions, and we don't have snow tires or chains on our vehicles. Our houses are designed to keep heat out rather than in. Most people don't have any thick winter coats in their closets nor snow boots. Usually our winters are mild enough that at worst I'll bust out an old ski jacket or throw on a scarf. So our normal response to any bit of snow or ice is just to shut down because it's safer than having people out on the roads. No work, no school, we just hunker down in our homes for the most part. So while millions of Texans were stuck in their homes, the power grid failed, leading officially to 246 Texans dying either as a direct or indirect result. Many of those direct deaths were from hypothermia because people couldn't heat their homes. Now, how come there weren't similar death tolls in our neighboring states that were also dealing with similar weather conditions, such as New Mexico or Louisiana? They were able to pull power from other states via either the western or eastern grids, whichever they were hooked up to. Texas did not have that option. Texans dying from hypothermia is unreal. It was actually pretty scary, not just the cold, but the complete lack of power. Even our phones weren't working properly. I couldn't get online to check any updates, and I couldn't even get through to call or text my friends and family apart from brief and sporadic moments when the power and or cell service would kick back on. I have friends who told me since then that they now have some form of PTSD from the experience, and they're not saying that to be hyperbolic. I'm trying to emphasize that it really was that bad. It wasn't just a bunch of Southerners complaining about being cold. Anyway, in the midst of all of this, our governor, Greg Abbott, went on Fox News and no other news channel to discuss what was happening. I think he went on Hannity's show, and Tucker Carlson also spoke about the polar vortex that was killing Texans. They blamed it on the windmills. Now, according to them, the green energy source was the one that failed, not the aging infrastructure that was knowingly inadequate. Instead of prioritizing saving lives, they took the opportunity to own the libs and stump for fossil fuels. I'm not even going to mention the energy bills that Texans were left with, because that's a whole other story. So what does any of this have to do with Enron? A lot, actually. It comes down to deregulation. Enron was a highly corrupt energy company based in Houston that operated more like a Ponzi scheme than a business. Its CFO was actually notorious and revered for his ability to cook the books. Beyond that, it was a highly toxic work environment that outwardly rewarded greed and double dealings. Enron's unethical business practices were also directly responsible for the rolling blackouts that the state of California was dealing with at the turn of the millennium. Those blackouts threw the state and its residents into debt because Enron artificially inflated energy costs by hoarding electricity. In other words, it was all completely avoidable, and the Enron employees most responsible for the blackout scheme were later promoted for their ingenuity. Ken Lay formed Enron back in the 80s during the Reagan administration. Now, deregulation was starting to roll out in the energy sector, which basically means that the government was taking a more hands-off approach to the oil and gas industries, allowing market capitalism to do its thing. Ken Lay was a big proponent of deregulation, and he was a big supporter of George W. Bush. Lay was a major donor to W's gubernatorial race here in Texas, and Enron would later be the single largest donor to his presidential race in 2000. So once W was elected governor of Texas, he deregulated the state's electricity markets just as Lay wanted him to do. And this is why, by the way, we gotta get money out of politics, Ted Cruz. Once W moved into the White House, Rick Perry took over as governor. Rick Perry would later be Trump's energy secretary, but during the 2021 polar vortex, by which time he was a non-office holder, he said Texans would be without electricity for longer than 3 days to keep the federal government out of their business. So you can see what we were dealing with. So at this point, our electricity sector is deregulated, but why do we have our own power grid? The United States has something called FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. According to its website, it's a federal agency that regulates the transmission and wholesale sale of electricity and natural gas in interstate commerce and regulates the transportation of oil by pipeline in interstate commerce. Interstate. FERC doesn't have any authority over energy transactions taking place within a state, as long as it doesn't cross state lines. So to evade oversight, Texas created its own energy grid, allowing it to do business however it so pleases. Now, this explains the 246 Texan deaths during the polar vortex. That said, FERC did warn Texas over a decade ago that our energy infrastructure was in need of maintenance and repairs, but since we're deregulated, there was little to no financial incentive for the state to actually heed those warnings. The energy companies didn't want to spend the money on the work that would have been required, and the state didn't make them. They all did nothing. So here we are in May, with 90-degree temps in May, with the promise of triple-digit heat in the coming months, and our power grid that's already struggling. Many power plants use the month of May to get ready for the summer months ahead, but several plants are now reporting that ERCOT, or the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, told them to hold off on any repairs they had planned in anticipation of the May heat wave. When the plant started failing, ERCOT released a statement acknowledging the failures without offering any possible explanations. Now, since the 2021 polar vortex, little has been done to protect the grid from another catastrophic failure. As much of the state is run by the fossil fuel industry, which of course is tied to the electric industry, it's become a talking point for Texan politicians on both sides of the aisle, especially as Beto O'Rourke challenges Greg Abbott for the governorship. Now, Beto, for his part, did more for Texans as a private citizen than either of our Republican senators or our Republican governor did during the polar vortex. John Cornyn said nothing. Ted Cruz fled to Cancun, and Greg Abbott complained about green energy. Beto organized a community phone banking effort, doing wellness checks on senior citizens, delivering food and water to them if they needed it, and even moving them to warmer locations to wait out the worst of the polar vortex. And as I mentioned earlier, February 2021 is still fresh in the minds of Texan voters. Okay, that's it. I'm done.